Imagine a sunny day at an amusement park where joyful shouts, laughter and carousel music can be heard all around. But suddenly this place of happiness and fun turns into the center of a real drama. A girl, not hiding her aggression, hits a black boy in the face just like that, without thinking about the consequences. Now imagine her face when she finds out who his father turns out to be. An FBI agent. Can you feel that tension? The fear that fills the air. What's going to happen next? Friends, while you're watching this story, post in the comments what your name is and where you're watching from. We love learning about each and every one of you. Your comments and support help us grow and create more and more videos like this. You are our inspiration. Every single one of your likes and comments is incredibly valuable to us. Without you, our channel wouldn't exist, and we really appreciate it. Thank you for being with us. Enjoy the show. It was a clear, warm day to perfect for a walk in the amusement park. The sky was shining azure without a single cloud. The sun was gently warming the earth, and a light breeze was blowing pleasantly on the faces of visitors, bringing a light aroma of cotton candy and caramel. It seemed that the very atmosphere was filled with joy, happy cries of children and ringing laughter of adults. Carousels were spinning, slides were rushing down. Every corner of the park seemed to be a place for a small celebration. In this environment of happiness, people seemed to have forgotten all their worries. Children were running around excitedly. Elderly couples were walking around holding hands, and parents were watching their children with a warm smile. The mood was carefree, as if for all present there were no problems, only this moment of fun and lightness. Joyful music was playing throughout the park, enhancing the feeling of carefree fun. Waiting in line for popular attractions only added to the excitement, and children were jumping up and down, impatiently pulling their parents by the hands, trying to bring the moment of joy closer. No one could have imagined that today something so dark would happen in this joyful and serene place that would disturb the holiday atmosphere. The general merriment enveloped the people, and everyone thought only of the many exciting moments ahead of them. But in the midst of this joyous crowd lurked an invisible threat, ready to march the sunny day. Amidst the cheerful crowd, near one of the most popular rides, the queue moved quietly forward. Children's faces were glowing with anticipation. Parents were discussing plans for the day, and everything around resembled a carefree holiday. But for one girl, standing in the middle of the line, this pastime was suddenly no longer so joyful. Her gaze, cold and judgmental, stopped on a boy who stood very close by. His dark skin and bright smile irritated her for no explainable reason, causing an incomprehensible wave of anger and contempt to rise in her soul. She began to look him over from head to toe, and her thoughts filled with preconceived judgments, infused with inner hatred. What is he doing here? Why do they always show up in places like this? She muttered to herself. Sure, no one around her could hear her. The little details in his demeanor, his laughter, and even his confused look when he caught her hostile gaze only added to her displeasure. Gloomy thoughts flashed through her mind, each one pushing her to show her attitude openly, without the slightest hesitation. Every time the boy turned around and happened to catch her gaze, her aggression seemed to escalate. Her face twisted in an expression that was more akin to disgust. In her eyes, he was nothing but an annoying nuisance, a man who didn't deserve her attention, much less a place in this park. In her mind, the prejudice swirled into a tight ball of hatred, fueling her internal monologue. The boy noticed her gaze, and his smile faded. He began to move carefully away, trying not to look in her direction. But it was his attempt to move away that only fueled her contempt more. From her perspective, he was nothing more than an outsider in this her world, a world where she believed there was no place for the likes of him. The thought was becoming obsessive to her, causing uncontrollable aggression. The longer she stared at him, the more her irritation turned to anger. Everything seemed to be a complaint. The way he laughed, the way he looked at the rides, the way he tried to hide behind the other kids. She began to notice her own heart pounding with anger, the hatred boiling up inside her like a flame. The girl continued to stare at the boy, her gaze growing harder and harder, filled with outright contempt. It seemed that every gesture, every look on her part was like an invisible slap, cold and humiliating. She couldn't hold back any longer, and without embarrassment, She began to throw words in his direction that made the boy shrink back. "Do you even realize where you are? Do you think you're welcome here?" she threw caustically, jutting her chin up as if her personal space had been desecrated by his presence. There was clear contempt in her voice, and those words seemed to cut through the air around her. Her voice was loud, and the people around her began to listen, distracted from their conversations. The boy lowered his eyes, trying not to meet her gaze, but that only made her cruelty worse. "You probably don't realize what you're doing here yourself. Why don't you go back where you came from?" she hissed, almost in a whisper, but so that he could hear every word. Her indignation was drenched in venom, and each phrase hurt more than the next. Her words cut into him like a knife edge, robbing him of his last vestige of confidence. The boy didn't know what to say. He just stood there, embarrassed and frightened, his hands clenched into fists but unable to defend himself. Pain flickered in his eyes, but the girl seemed to enjoy his vulnerability. In her mind, he was just the embodiment of what she hated for no reason, just because of his skin color, his background, the fact that he was different. A small crowd started to gather around. People were looking at each other, and some were trying to figure out what was going on, but the girl didn't pay any attention to them. She knew they were watching, but on the contrary, it was as if she was proud of it, enjoying the moment when her anger and hatred got full expression. "So, don't you know what to say? Do you even realize that this is no place for the likes of you?" She threw a disparaging look at him, as if pushing him away with a single glance. Her last words were like a blow. The boy trembled, his hands shaking, but he tried to hold on without answering her. The girl looked at him, as if his existence were an insult to her. The girl could no longer contain her hatred. The contempt in her gaze turned into an open challenge. She squinted her eyes and, loud enough for everyone around her to hear, threw harsh, derogatory words at the boy like blow after blow. Her voice rang out, deliberately piercing the silence that hung around. Those around her began to pay attention. People stopped, amazed at what was happening, but the girl only seemed to feed off their presence, feeling even more confident. "Hey, you," she shouted with a sneer. "You think you mean anything here? Look at you." She curled her lips in a contemptuous grin and folded her arms across her chest, showing that the sight of him only disgusted her. "What? You think you're welcome in this part? It's no place for the likes of you." Her words were drenched in cold cruelty, and every glance she gave him cut like a sharp knife to the gut. She laughed loudly, and her laughter sounded like a slap, humiliating and painful. The boy tensed, his shoulders slumped, and he struggled to hide his fright, but the girl saw it and continued on, like a predator sensing weakness in its prey. She stepped closer, sharply, so that he instinctively stepped back. Her face was curved in a mocking grin, and her eyes glittered with sadistic pleasure. "You must be in the wrong place," she said slowly, almost in a whisper, but with such force that her words seemed to echo around her. "Why don't you go back to where you belong?" She jerked her head sharply toward the exit of the park, showing him the way as if throwing away trash. The people watching around her began to look at her. Some stood in confusion, some openly condemned her with a look, but it didn't stop her. It was as if she didn't notice anyone around her or, on the contrary, enjoyed the attention, every glance thrown in her direction. The girl continued, even louder, as if she was overwhelmed by a whirlwind of hatred and could not stop. "You think you're important? No one here wants you." Her voice became sharper and her words harsher. She waved her hand as if to show him that he was nothing but a lowlife. "Get out of here!" The boy stood as if paralyzed, humiliated and helpless under her fury. Her words seemed to hit him in the face, one after another, leaving deep marks not only on his soul, but also in the minds of those who heard her cruelty. At some point, the hatred boiling in the girl turned into physical action. She felt her hands trembling with rage, and in one sharp moment, without restraint, she stepped forward and slapped the boy across the face. Her hand flew up in the air, and there was a thud that was deafening in the silence of the crowd around her. The boy didn't even have time to defend himself. The blow hit him squarely on the cheek, sharp, hard, and he staggered backward, barely able to stay on his feet. For a moment everything frowned. His eyes widened in mute shock and horror, and he instinctively pressed his hand to his cheek, which began to redden from the blow. At that moment, pain and humiliation intertwined, and tears glistened in his eyes. He tried to hold them back, but his face betrayed everything: fear, pain, and the incredible embarrassment of what had happened. The crowd around them frowned. People stood there, not believing their eyes, and everything happened so fast that many people didn't even immediately realize what had just happened. Some people gasped, others covered their mouths with their hands, not knowing how to react. There was tension in the air, as if everyone was afraid to take the next step, for fear that the girl would attack the boy again. Some parents nudged their children back so they wouldn't see the scene, but that only drew more attention. Adults looked at each other, and many had indignation and clear condemnation written on their faces. Whispers started coming from all corners. People were discussing what had happened, wondering how she could dare to do such a thing. The girl stood there, breathing hard, fists clenched, seemingly unaware of what had happened. There was a mixture of gloating and satisfaction on her face, something like triumph in her eyes. She was clearly proud of what she had done, and she wasn't embarrassed by the attention around her. She felt that she had every right to take the blow, that her anger was justified. In the silence that followed, heavy, confident footsteps sounded. A tall, sturdily built man with hard features, wearing a dark leather jacket, began to make his way through the crowd. His eyes, like steel, pierced the crowd, and people began to step aside, giving him way. He walked purposefully and confidently, not wasting a second to think. His every movement betrayed strength and firmness, and the expression on his face portended a storm. It was the boy's father. When he saw his son standing there with his cheek reddened from the blow and his head lowered, his face trembled slightly. There was a fleeting glimmer of pain in his eyes, full of authority and hardness, but he instantly resumed his stern mask, as if unable to believe that his son could have been subjected to such humiliation. He looked at the boy, his gaze unwavering in its determination to find out what was going on. The girl frowned. Her posture changed. She seemed to shrink under his gaze, which was heavy, cold, and dangerous. Only now did she feel the real anxiety that had crept deep inside as her eyes met this man's. His presence was powerful and overwhelming, a menacing strength not so much physical as inner, as if he were as unshakable as a rock. And nothing she said, no explanation, could change his mind about what had happened. He approached her slowly, not taking his eyes off her, and every step he took seemed to cut into her consciousness. There was no anger on his face, only cold-blooded calmness and absolute self-confidence, which only increased the girl's fear. This man wasn't just an outraged parent. He was someone far more dangerous. He didn't shout, didn't demand explanations, but his mere presence, his uncompromising gaze spoke more than any words. His face remained impenetrable, but there was a threat in his eyes, like a warning that she would have to answer for her actions. The people gathered around him watched tensely, afraid to move or even breathe too loudly. They intuitively felt that this man was not someone who could be argued with or appeased with a simple apology. She felt a cold fear start to creep through her body as the man in the leather jacket stopped right in front of her, his impassive but piercing eyes fixed on her. Her breathing quickened and her heart hammered with such force that it felt like it was about to burst out. Suddenly all her repressive words and ostensible confidence seemed to evaporate, leaving her alone, defenseless against this intimidating figure. The next second, she heard someone in the crowd whisper, "That's an FBI agent." She took a step backward, her face pale and her eyes blurred with terror. Her knees began to buckle, and a barely perceptible shiver ran through her body. The realization of who stood before her struck with unstoppable force, consuming her to the very core of her being. Now all her actions, her words, this cruel blow dealt to the defenseless boy, took on a new reality, a terrible and inevitable one. It became clear to her that this man, this FBI agent, had not just come here. He was a man for whom justice was not just a word, but part of his profession. And now she knew that it would cost him absolutely nothing for him to bring her to justice, possibly ruining everything she had in her life. Panic crept into her eyes, and she could no longer hide it. She frantically tried to think of what to say, how to justify herself, but the words stuck in her throat. Everything that had seemed so weighty and meaningful before was instantly meaningless. No apologies, no excuses could soften the situation. Now she knew that the mistakes she'd made in those few minutes were too many, and they were all swirling into one huge lump that was slowly but inexorably coming toward her, threatening to swallow her up. Her eyes raced. She tried to avoid his gaze, but it was impossible. The man standing in front of her was the embodiment of her fear, her punishment, her inevitable end. A moment that seemed like an eternity stretched in tense silence until the boy's father, Eastern FBI agent, calm and unwavering in his determination, stepped forward and looked directly into the girl's eyes. His gaze, cold and penetrating, was filled with a power that made her want to fall through the ground. Every time she tried to turn away or take a step back, he only made her feel more helpless, not giving her the slightest chance to escape. The boy's father addressed the crowd, asking witnesses to come forward and describe what they had seen. People who had previously been silently watching the scene began to speak out, some with a shudder in their voices, others with judgment. One person described how he saw the girl first call the boy names, how she raised her voice and tried to humiliate him. Another witness confirmed that she insulted him based on the color of his skin and described the look on her face full of hatred and contempt when she said those words. The testimonies began to overlap, painting a complete picture of her behavior that could no longer be dismissed. The boy's father listened attentively to each of them, his face impassive, but with each new testimony, the girl was getting worse. She felt her palms sweating and began to rub her fingers nervously, trying to hold back her inner terror. But it was useless. The words of the people around her were like hammers, knocking the ground out from under her feet. Then he turned to her. His voice was steady, but there was a hidden power in it that allowed no objection. I want to understand what motivated you to hit my son. Do you realize what you've done? She started babbling, trying to justify that the boy provoked her, that she didn't mean to. She just couldn't help herself. But every word she said sounded weaker and more helpless. Those around her heard her excuses, but no one tried to take her side. Her voice shook, her phrases became muddled, and finally she faltered, realizing that her words would make no impression on the man standing in front of her. He was looking at her as if he could see right through her, like a professional who didn't need false excuses. Do you think that's enough? He said quietly but firmly, stepping closer. You just humiliated a child. My son hit him in front of everyone, and now you're trying to justify yourself. His words hung in the air, intensifying her guilt. She frantically tried to find something else, some way out, but her mind seemed to fail under the pressure of the circumstances and the growing horror of what awaited her. Every word, every look from those around her now seemed to scream in her face about her mistake. As the trial progressed, more and more witnesses began to share stories that gradually revealed her true nature. There were people in the crowd who recognized the girl and recalled incidents where she had already shown aggression and hatred towards others, especially those who were different from her in terms of skin color or nationality. A man standing nearby nodded grimly and said, I've seen her before. She always acts like that if someone, well, not like her, is around. Last week I noticed her being rude to a waiter in a cafe, simply because he was from another country. At first I thought it was just a whim, but now I see that it's her usual behavior. Another woman recounted an unpleasant incident in a parking lot a few months ago. She yelled at a woman that she was taking someone else's place and should go to her country. Everyone was quiet at the time, but she acted so confident, as if she had the right to decide who should be here and who shouldn't. Her words were full of hate. The woman nervously adjusted her back, trying to hide her own tension at the memory of the incident. Her face paled with each new testimony, and she felt her own fear and shame growing stronger as she realized that her secret hatred was now on display. It seemed to her that each of these people now saw the real her, the one who had hitherto hidden behind the facade of ordinary life. She could no longer hide behind superficial excuses, could no longer deny a single word, because people had seen her in these situations with their own eyes. A heavy sigh went through the crowd as they realized that what stood before them was not just a girl who had snapped in a fit of anger, but a person for whom contempt for others had become a way of life. Her prejudice, her hatred, hidden in everyday situations, was now exposed to everyone, and these people, the bystanders to her dark deeds, looked at her with open disgust and contempt. The girl began to realize that everything she had been hiding for so long was now revealed. These people knew the real her, not the one she tried to show to the world, but the one who was willing to humiliate and harm others just because they were different from her. She saw the crowd turn away from her, judging her, and felt that her reputation, her future now lay in ruins. After the incident, her life changed irreversibly. At first, it was slanted glances on the street, caustic remarks in her direction, which she began to catch everywhere she went. In her small town, the news spread quickly. A video of the incident hit social media, where users shared footage of her openly insulting and punching a child, humiliating him for the color of his skin. The clip instantly caused a storm of outrage. Comments were merciless. People expressed their disgust, condemnation, and demanded justice. Her personal social media pages were flooded with angry messages, and she was soon forced to delete them, unable to withstand the pressure. The first blow was the loss of friends. Many of those she had considered close to her either openly turned away or simply stopped communicating, preferring not to be associated with a person whose reputation had been tarnished by such an act. Only a few people tried to support her, but even they soon drifted away, seeing that the consequences of her actions were too serious and irreversible. The situation worsened when the news reached her employer. The company, which valued its reputation, could not afford to employ an employee whose actions had caused such strong public condemnation. She was called in for a talk, and, despite her attempts to explain herself, she was fired. Her employment record now showed her dismissal, and wherever she sent her resume, she was rejected. Word of the scandal had already spread, and no company wanted to contact her. Soon she felt the consequences in her studies as well. The school she was attending was not ready to turn a blind eye to her behavior. The administration called her in for a talk and offered to leave of her own accord to avoid further problems. Her reputation was ruined, and doors that had been opened before were now slammed in her face. She became an outcast in her own town. People avoided her, turned their backs on the streets, even crossed the road when they saw her. Adults openly condemned her, and teenagers whispered behind her back, laughing and discussing what she had done. Every time she left the house, she felt the weight of the scornful stares and realized that she couldn't change anything. Within days of the incident, the story of a girl hitting a black boy at an amusement park began to take on a scale she could never have imagined. The local news quickly picked up the story, making headlines that became a nightmare for her. Park scandal, teen accused of racist attack on child. Shocking incident in front of hundreds of witnesses. The newspapers and news sites published her picture. The girl's serious face, frown seen in the frame, became a symbol of shame and hatred, from which there was no hiding. The news soon spread beyond the local media. Regional and then national TV channels began to cover the story, adding more and more details, revealing past incidents where she had shown racist attitudes and aggression. Witness interviews posted in newspapers and on screen were full of condemning words, and some people who had previously known her agreed to talk to reporters, describing her as someone with persistent prejudiced views. Even former classmates and colleagues recalled situations where she made harsh and unpleasant remarks about people of other nationalities. The story about the incident began to be discussed on talk shows. Experts and psychologists took apart her behavior, drawing conclusions about how dangerous such an attitude was and how it was destroying society. Her name and face became associated with a prime example of intolerance, which everyone spoke of with disgust. The story quickly went viral, and a real storm started on social media. Users shared videos, posts, and articles calling for a boycott, discussing her act, and expressing their outrage. Some went even further, creating petitions demanding strict punishment for her, signed by thousands of people. Social media had become a field of constant attack for her. Every time she opened her phone, she was greeted by hundreds of notifications, angry comments, private messages with threats and derogatory words, tags and mentions calling her a monster. She stopped going online, but even that didn't save her from the publicity. People started recognizing her on the street, whispering behind her back, some coming up to throw her words in her face, and some coming up to take pictures of her as if it were a sensation. Every new report in the press, every news release or article was like a blow. Her name had become a byword, a symbol of everything people hated and rejected. Her reputation, her future, everything had been destroyed, and there was no trace of her past life left. This case was a vivid example of how quickly lives can change because of rash actions motivated by hatred and bias. The story of a girl who succumbed to her worst sides and allowed bias to drive her actions showed society at large how destructive intolerance can be. Just a few minutes of her anger led to consequences that destroyed her future and changed her life forever. Those around her, friends, family, neighbors, were shocked to see how far people can go when their decisions are motivated by contempt for others. Emotions that had seemed insignificant to her had led her to openly humiliate an innocent person, and now she was a victim of her own hatred, losing respect, trust, and essentially herself. She may not have thought her actions would ever be evaluated so closely, but the world has changed, and such displays of hatred no longer go unnoticed. This incident served as a reminder to many that the prejudice we carry inside always finds its way out, destroying not only the lives of others, but also our own. Intolerance, hatred, and aggression, though they may seem like temporary expressions of emotion, remain in people's memories like an indelible mark. Although the girl will have to live with the consequences of her act, this case became a warning to others. Ill-considered words and actions, especially when they are aimed at humiliation or aggression, can cause the collapse of everything that a person has built his or her whole life. The story of her fall underscores the importance of respecting people regardless of their color, background, culture, or religion. It reminds everyone that every deed, every thought, and every word directed against another person based on their appearance can lead to trouble and shame. Time passed, but the consequences of her deed did not disappear. She tried to return to her normal life, but her name, face, and reputation were already firmly associated with her rash, violent act. Every new attempt to get a job or find support turned out to be a reminder of the incident. Even strangers recognized her, and communication with them began with prejudice and distrust. She began to realize that the world had become a very different place for her, as if the door to the place where she could just be herself had been closed to her. She was now that girl, the one who had made the unforgivable mistake. That stigma wouldn't let go, forcing her to remember every day what had happened. Regret for her behavior kept her on her toes, and the realization of her own responsibility tormented her. Over time, she began to search for answers, trying to understand why her life had taken this path and how her own prejudices and latent aggression had managed to take over her mind and destroy everything. She began seeing a psychologist, participating in community programs against discrimination, having difficult and painful conversations with herself, trying to understand where her hatred came from and how to change it. Months passed, and step by step, day by day, she tried to start a new life, conscious and devoid of previous prejudices. She no longer looked for excuses for her mistakes, but sought sincere understanding. These efforts helped her at least partially restore her reputation in the eyes of the few who were willing to see a change in her. She accepted that this incident would forever be a part of her story, a lesson she would carry with her as a reminder of how fragile and precious human life and respect can be. Her life was now a different example, an example of how wrong and cruel actions can be corrected through a sincere desire for change and understanding. But the price she had to pay remained high and unavoidable. Friends, this story makes you think about a lot of things. Write in the comments what you think about what happened. Perhaps some of you have experienced racism in your life. Share your stories. It's important for us to know your opinions and experiences, because each of you helps us to make this channel better and create important topics for discussion. We really appreciate each and every one of you. Your support is incredibly important to us. If you enjoyed the video and think these stories should be discussed, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. This will help us bring more important topics to a wider audience. We wish you a good day, and may there be more respect, understanding, and kindness around you.